Patanjali. Patanjali, Sanskrit, was a sage in Hinduism, thought to be the author of a number of Sanskrit works. The greatest of these are the Yoga Sutras, a classical yoga text. There is doubt as to whether the sage Patanjali is the author of all the works attributed to him, as there are a number of known historical authors of the same name. A great deal of scholarship has been devoted over the last century to the issue of the historicity or identity of this author or these authors. Amongst the more important authors called Patanjali are: Patanjali continues to be honored with invocations and shrines in some forms of modern postural yoga, such as Iyengar Yoga and Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga. Name. According to Monier Williams, the word Patanjali is a compound name from Pata, Sanskrit, falling, flying, and Anj, honor, celebrate, beautiful, or Anjali, reverence, joining palms of the hand. Life. Louis Renou was among the many scholars who have suggested that the Patanjali who wrote on yoga was a different person than the Patanjali who wrote a commentary on Panini's grammar. In 1914, James Wood proposed that they were the same person. In 1922, Surendranath Dasgupta presented a series of arguments to tentatively propose that the famed grammar text and the yoga text author may be identical. The view that these were likely two different authors is generally accepted, but some Western scholars consider them as a single entity. Some in the Indian tradition have held that one Patanjali wrote treatises on grammar, medicine and yoga. This has been memorialized in a verse by Poha at the start of his commentary on the Yoga Sutras called Rajamartanda, 11th century, and the following verse found in Shivarama's 18th century text. This tradition is discussed by Muhlenbeld, who traces this relatively late idea back to Poha, 11th century, who was perhaps influenced by a verse by Bhartrhari, ca. 5th century, that speaks of an expert in yoga, medicine and grammar who, however, is not named. No known Sanskrit text prior to the 10th century states that the one and the same Patanjali was behind all the three treatises. The sage Patanjali is said to have attained samadhi through yogic meditation at the Brahmapuriswarar temple located at Tirupati, Tamil Nadu, India. Jiva Samadhi of sage Patanjali, which is now an enclosed meditation hall, can be seen near the Brahma's shrine within Brahmapuriswarar temple complex. Grammar tradition. In the grammatical tradition, Patanjali is believed to have lived in the 2nd century BCE. He wrote a Mahabhasya on Panini's sutras, in a form that quoted the commentary of Katyayana's Vertikas. This is a major influential work on Sanskrit grammar and linguistics. The dating of Patanjali and his Mahabhasya is established by a combination of evidence, those from the Maurya Empire period, the historical events mentioned in the examples he used to explain his ideas, the chronology of ancient classical Sanskrit texts that respect his teachings, and the mention of his text or his name in ancient Indian literature. Of the three ancient grammarians, the chronological dating of Patanjali to mid-2nd century BCE is considered as reasonably accurate by mainstream scholarship. The text influenced Buddhist grammatical literature, as well as memoirs of travelers to India. For example, the Chinese pilgrim Meitzing mentions that the Mahabhasya is studied in India and advanced scholars learn it in 3 years. Yoga tradition. In the yoga tradition, Patanjali is a revered name. This Patanjali Sutra comprises the sutras about yoga, Yoga Sutras, and the commentary integral to the sutras, called the Bhashya. Some consider the sutras and the Bhashya to have had different authors, the commentary being ascribed to an editor, Skt. Vyasa. According to Philip Moss, the same person named Patanjali composed the sutras and the Bhashya commentary. Radhakrishnan and Moore attribute the text to the grammarian Patanjali, dating it as 2nd century BCE, during the Maurya Empire, 322 to 185 BCE. Moss estimates Patanjali's Yoga Sutras date to be about 400 CE, based on tracing the commentaries on it published in the 1st millennium CE. Edwin Bryant, on the other hand, surveys the major commentators in his translation of the Yoga Sutras. He states that most scholars date the text shortly after the turn of the Common Era, circa 1st to 2nd century, but that it has been placed as early as several centuries before that. Bryant concludes that a number of scholars have dated the Yoga Sutras as late as the 4th or 5th century CE, but these arguments have all been challenged, and late chronology for this Patanjali and his text are problematic. Tamil Saivite legend. Regarding his early years, a Tamil Saiva Siddhanta tradition from around 10th century AD holds that Patanjali learned yoga along with 7 other disciples from the great yogic guru Nandideva, as stated in Tirumular's Tirumandiram, Tantra 1. Translation. Works. Whether the two works, the Yoga Sutras and the Mahabhasya, are by the same author has been the subject of considerable debate. The authorship of the two is first attributed to the same person in Bojadeva's Rajamartanda, a relatively late, 10th century, commentary on the Yoga Sutras, as well as several subsequent texts. As for the texts themselves, the Yoga Sutra 344 cites a sutra as that from Patanjali by name, but this line itself is not from the Mahabhasaya. This 10th century legend of single authorship is doubtful. The literary styles and contents of the Yoga Sutras and the Mahabhasaya are entirely different, and the only work on medicine attributed to Patanjali is lost. Sources of doubt include the lack of cross-references between the texts, and no mutual awareness of each other, unlike other cases of multiple works by, later, Sanskrit authors. Also, some elements in the Yoga Sutras may date from as late as the 4th century AD, but such changes may be due to divergent authorship, or due to later additions which are not atypical in the oral tradition. Most scholars refer to both works as by Patanjali, without meaning that they are by the same author. In addition to the Mahabhasaya and Yoga Sutras, the 11th century commentary on Karaka by the Bengali scholar K. Krapanadatha, and the 16th century text Patanjali Karita ascribes to Patanjali a medical text called the Karaka Pratisamskrita, now lost, which is apparently a revision, Pratisamskrita, of the medical treatise by Karaka. While there is a short treatise on yoga in the medical work called the Karakasvita, by Karaka, towards the end of the chapter called Sarirastana, it is notable for not bearing much resemblance to the Yoga Sutras, and in fact presents a form of eightfold yoga that is completely different from that laid out by Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras and the commentary Yoga Sutra Bhasaya. Yoga Sutra. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali are 196 Indian sutras, aphorisms, on yoga. It was the most translated ancient Indian text in the medieval era, having been translated into about 40 Indian languages and 2 non-Indian languages, Old Javanese and Arabic. The text fell into obscurity for nearly 700 years from the 12th to 19th century, and made a comeback in late 19th century due to the efforts of Swami Vivekananda and others. It gained prominence again as a comeback classic in the 20th century. Before the 20th century, history indicates the Indian yoga scene was dominated by other yoga texts such as the Bhagavad Gita, Yoga Vashishta, and Yoga Yajnavalkya. Scholars consider the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali formulations as one of the foundations of classical yoga philosophy of Hinduism. Mahabhasaya. The Mahabhasaya, great commentary, of Patanjali on the Astadhyayi of Panini is a major early exposition on Panini, along with the somewhat earlier Vartika by Katyayana. Patanjali relates to how words and meanings are associated. Patanjali claims Shabdapramana, that the evidentiary value of words is inherent in them, and not derived externally. The word-meaning association is natural. These issues in the word-meaning relation, symbol, would be elaborated in the Sanskrit linguistic tradition, in debates between the Mimamsa, Nyaya and Buddhist schools over the next 15 centuries. Sphota. Patanjali also defines an early notion of sphota, which would be elaborated considerably by later Sanskrit linguists like Bhartrhari. In Patanjali, a sphota, from spht, spurt/burst, is the invariant quality of speech. The noisy element, vani, audible part, can be long or short, but the sphota remains unaffected by individual speaker differences. Thus, a single letter or sound, varna, such as k, p or a is an abstraction, distinct from variants produced in actual enunciation. This concept has been linked to the modern notion of phoneme, the minimum distinction that defines semantically distinct sounds. Thus a phoneme is an abstraction for a range of sounds. However, in later writings, especially in Bhartrhari, 6th century CE, the notion of sphota changes to become more of a mental state, preceding the actual utterance, akin to the lemma. Patanjali's writings also elaborate some principles of morphology, prakriya. In the context of elaborating on Panini's aphorisms, he also discusses Katyayana's commentary, which are also aphoristic and sutra-like. In the later tradition, these were transmitted as embedded in Patanjali's discussion. In general, he defends many positions of Panini which were interpreted somewhat differently in Katyayana. Metaphysics as grammatical motivation. Unlike Panini's objectives in the Ashtadhyayi, which is to distinguish correct forms and meanings from incorrect ones, Shabdanashashana, Patanjali's objectives are more metaphysical. These include the correct recitations of the scriptures, agama, maintaining the purity of texts, raksha, clarifying ambiguity, asamda, and also the pedagogic goal of providing an easier learning mechanism, lagu. This stronger metaphysical bent has also been indicated by some as one of the unifying themes between the Yoga Sutras and the Mahabhasaya, although a close examination of actual Sanskrit usage by Woods showed no similarities in language or terminology. The text of the Mahabhasaya was first critically edited by the 19th-century Orientalist Franz Kielhorn, who also developed philological criteria for distinguishing Katyayana's voice from Patanjali's. Subsequently, a number of other editions have come out, the 1968 text and translation by S.T. Joshi and J.H.F. Rudbergen often being considered definitive. Regrettably, the latter work is incomplete. Patanjali also writes with a light touch. For example, his comment on the conflicts between the orthodox Brahmanic, Astika, groups, versus the heterodox, and Astika groups, Buddhism, Jainism, and atheists, seems relevant for religious conflict even today. The hostility between these groups was like that between a mongoose and a snake. He also sheds light on contemporary events, commenting on the recent Greek incursion, and also on several tribes that lived in the northwest regions of the subcontinent. Patanjali Tantra. Patanjali is also the reputed author of a medical text called Patanjala, also called Patanjala or Patanjali Tantra. This text is quoted in many yoga and health-related Indian texts. Patanjali is called a medical authority in a number of Sanskrit texts such as Yoga Ratnakara, Yoga Ratnasamukaya, Padarthajnana, Kakardata Bhasya. Some of these quotes are unique to Patanjali, but others are also found in major Hindu medical treatises such as Karaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita. There is a fourth scholar also named Patanjali, who likely lived in 8th century CE and wrote a commentary on Karaka Samhita, and this text is called Karakavardika. The two medical scholars named Patanjali may be the same person, but generally accepted to be completely different person than the Patanjali who wrote the Sanskrit grammar classic Mahabhasaya. Legacy Patanjali is honored with invocations and shrines in some modern schools of yoga, including Iyengar Yoga and Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga. The yoga scholar David Gordon White writes that yoga teacher training often includes mandatory instruction in the Yoga Sutra. White calls this curious to say the least, since the text is in his view essentially irrelevant to yoga as it is taught and practiced today, commenting that the Yoga Sutra is nearly devoid of discussion of postures, stretching, and breathing. Discussion of postures, stretching, and breathing. Discussion